Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thanks for coming. My name is Joe Dawson. I'm the commander of the Francis S. Bartow Camp, number 93, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and I'd like to thank you for braving this rainy, cold weather to be here with us tonight. This is dead of winter for Savannah, Georgia. I just had a pleasant thought, though. Tomorrow our forecast is sunny with a high of 56. We could be in Boston. What do they have? 1 degree and more snow? The more I read about this war between the states thing, the more I become thoroughly convinced that the real cause of the war is this. The North didn't want to give up their winter homes and their retirement communities. Okay, you got to have a sense of humor. Anyway, as I mentioned, I'm with an organization called the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with our group, we're not a hate group, and we're not affiliated with any hate group. Our members had one or more ancestors who fought for the South in the war between the states. Our efforts concentrate solely on the verifiable truths of that war. In 1866, a joint resolution of Congress authorized the compilation and publication under the auspices of the War Department a set of books officially entitled The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. They include first-hand accounts, orders, reports, maps, diagrams, and correspondence drawn from War and Navy Department records of both the Confederate and the Union governments. They consist of 128 volumes for the armies and 30 volumes for the navies. The good thing about this set is that it was published over a period of 20 years from 1881 to 1901, well before the term political correctness was invented. They contain the actual facts of that war as recorded by the United States government. I hope that it's the truth that you're seeking tonight, because you're going to hear the actual words of General Sherman and some of his officers. Sherman's words are not warm and fuzzy just so everybody can feel good. It's exactly what Sherman himself and other Union officers wrote. It's my firm belief that the true historian would much prefer the facts versus politically correct and opinionated history. We chose this night for our event because 150 years ago, at this very moment, the surrendered city of Columbia, South Carolina, was in flames, burned by Mr. Sherman's army. Our speaker for the evening is Mr. David Dickey. He's a historian who loves to share the truth, even if it's not politically correct. His volunteer speeches often don't win him friends from those on the politically correct side of the fence, but that doesn't faze him. He's never turned his back on his Southern heritage, as some others have, because of the fear of being hurt financially. David is a partner of the law firm Oliver Manor. He's a former CPA with Big 8 experience, one of the top 8 accounting firms of the country. He holds a Bachelor's of Business degree in accounting from Armstrong and a Master's in accounting. He went to the University of Georgia Law School and was selected to serve on the Georgia Law Review because of his research and writing abilities. As a lawyer, he practices in the fields of estates and trust, corporations, and estate planning, and has mastered them all. He's a member of the prestigious American College of Trust and Estate Council and has been selected to the Best Lawyers in America, Super Lawyers of America, Georgia's Legal Elite, and other similar professional listings. He's given a lot of his time to assisting in forming charitable organizations over the years, most recently including Center Court, improving lives through the Accountability Incorporated. He also regularly helps out Armstrong and St. Joseph's Candler by putting on seminars for them. In the last 2 weeks, he's published an article for the CEO magazine on changing trends in estate planning, and a 3-part article on Revolutionary War General Hugh Mercer for the Drumbeat, the national magazine of the Sons of the Revolution. He is the Historian General of the National Society of the Sons of the Revolution, as well as the historian of several local groups. He organized and is the first president of Savannah's New Welsh Society and belongs to many other cultural and genealogical heritage societies. Tonight, you're going to see a presentation where his skills as a lawyer, accountant, researcher, historian, and concerned citizen all blend together with his passion and pride of the South. Although he likes estate planning and is one of the best at it in this area, I'd hate to be on the other side of him in a jury trial. As you're about to discover, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my very dear friend, Mr. David Dickey.
The origin of this particular speech was that my good friend Tom Edenfield called me and said that a leader of one of the local historical societies had come to one of his lunch clubs to speak and had praised Sherman to the hilt, said he wasn't such a bad guy after all, and would I please come present the other side of the picture. So I said I would, and from there it's kind of grown. I've given this same speech under different titles, but I thought tonight we would say, is Sherman a war criminal? Is this fact or myth? And the name is a subtitle is Sherman Convicted by His Own Words. Now, this is what I call revisionism in action. The Georgia Historical Society announced on November 7th that they would commemorate the beginning of Sherman's march to the sea with a marker. This is what was said about it. This marker is part of the Georgia Historical Society's Civil War 150 Historical Marker Project, telling stories around the state that hadn't been told or that shed new light on familiar stories, said the president of the CEO of the Georgia Historical Society. There are a lot of misconceptions about General Sherman and the March to the Sea that are not based on historical evidence. And we've tried to correct some of those in this marker to see a familiar event in a new light. Well, my question is essentially right off the bat, what is a new light? And what is better evidence than contemporary statements and accounts of people who lived through this and actually recorded their statements in their diaries, or officers who were in the field writing orders and letters back and forth to each other, stating exactly what was really happening. You know, for some historical revisionist who's of a Puritan slant from Harvard to come down with a new view of history to justify an illegal invasion of the South 150 years later, is that what we mean by new light? I mean, perhaps the misconceptions are those of the Georgia Historical Society. Here's their marker, word for word. On November 15, 1864, during the Civil War, that's the first problem. Wasn't a civil war. Civil war is within a country when one group rebels against the country. If the South had the right to secede, which will be the topic of another speech another day, then this was a war between two separate countries. So it would be appropriately called the war between the states, not the Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, U.S. forces under Sherman set out from Atlanta on a march to the sea, which was a military campaign designed to destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war. I'll grant that. And break the will of its people to resist. I'll grant that. After destroying Atlanta's industrial and business, but not residential districts, Sherman's 62,500 men marched over 250 miles, reaching Savannah in mid-December. Contrary to popular myth, I strongly contest this statement. Sherman's troops primarily destroyed only property used for waging war: railroads, train depots, factories, cotton gins, and warehouses. They did a lot of that, granted. They also did a lot of destruction of homes. Abandoning their supply base, they lived off the land, destroying food they could not consume. I'll agree with that. They also liberated thousands of enslaved African Americans in their path. I don't agree with that. As you will see, what happened was when they went on a plantation, what they would do is they would take their bayonets. They would force the young black males at the point of a bayonet to be, against their will and against their wishes, conscripted into the Union Army. Sherman's hard hand of war demoralized Confederates. Yes, it did that, hastening the end of slavery. That's debatable. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the South. It didn't free any slaves in the North. It didn't free any slaves in the border state. The first page says slaves are freed. The next 4 pages take it back. It's like an insurance policy in a way. So when I read this, I had a little bit of indigestion, and I think anybody who was born in the South may have the same thing. Okay, now what I want to start off with is tell you what was happening in what they called the Valley up around Richmond and Lexington. In June of 1864, the Union General David Hunter marched towards Lexington, Virginia. He captured the town, and on the 12th, he ordered the burning of the Virginia Military Institute and the governor's house, Governor Letcher, as he permitted the looting of nearby Washington University, which today is known as Washington and Lee. His men even stole the statue on the grounds of George Washington. But they were delayed in their approach to Lynchburg, where they were headed to burn that whole town down, by Confederate General McCausland. Now, McCausland attacked Hunter's leading elements with a small cavalry brigade under his command. McCausland was a Western Virginian. He was a former VMI professor of Scots-Irish extraction, as many of us are, and he was able to delay Hunter. And Hunter retreated. Lynchburg was reinforced by John Breckinridge, the presidential candidate, and Jubal Early, who a lot of your ancestors may have fought under if they were from this area. And they saved the town from destruction. Now, Hunter and his men were out of food, so they retreated to the mountains of West Virginia rather than face the Confederate forces in a fair fight. It was all fun and games to who they called Black Dave Hunter, okay? While he'd been looting, raping, and pillaging innocent civilians. But he skedaddled when he was faced with resistance from armed men. Now, General Early wrote this in the records. I want you to pay attention to some of this language, especially the language that's underlined. The scenes on Hunter's route from Lynchburg had been truly heartrending. Houses had been burned, and women and children left without shelter. The country had been stripped of provisions, and many families had been left without a morsel to eat. Furniture and clothing had been cut to pieces, and old men and children were robbed of all clothing except what they were wearing. The ladies' trunks had been rifled and their dresses torn to pieces in mere wantonness. Even Negro girls lost their little finery. We now had renewed evidences of outrages committed by the commanding general's orders in burning and plundering private houses. In the same country, there was a Christian gentleman, Mr. McCrae, who was hung because he killed a straggling and marauding federal soldier while in the act of defending his family against insulting and outraging acts against the ladies in the family. Now, do we think this sort of thing happened? Or is he just making this up? I mean, he's fighting a war. He's too busy to just make something like this up. Okay, but we're going to find out in this analysis what we call corroborating testimony. In a court, if you have over here one piece of evidence and another piece of evidence over here, and they both say the same thing, and they're brought to you by two different people, you can count on those being the same. That's called corroboration. That's why in ancient Hebrew law, often you had to have at least two witnesses whose story jived in order to convict somebody. So, under orders of Early, McCausland burned Chambersburg. They were in Pennsylvania. Okay, that should be a 3 there, incidentally. Now, during the war between the states, how many northern towns were burned by the Confederate Army? Anybody got any idea? One town. For the burning of this single town of Chambersburg, McCausland's name was anathema above the Mason-Dixon line. Okay. For more than a generation, he was called such things as an outlaw, a brigand, a violator of all the decencies of war and the laws thereof, and a beast who warred on women and children. Yet today, American history records Sherman as a hero. Is this some sort of double standard? Sherman, who did much more than McCausland, is known to history as one of the finest generals that ever put on the blue suit. But for burning one town, McCausland's a brigand. So McCausland's response to being called these names is as follows. The burning of Chambersburg has been talked about a great deal, and I have received my share and much more too of abuse from the federal side. I now say that it was an act of war, and such a one as is recognized by all nations. Lex talionis is one of the rules of war, and this comes clearly under the rule. That means, revenge, retaliation, essentially, for an improper act. Then he goes on to describe, in his words, Hunter had gone into the valley and done everything imaginable. Houses had been destroyed, leaving helpless women and children, homeless and without shelter, furniture, and bedding, cut to pieces. Old and young had been robbed of everything except the clothes they wore. Families were left without a morsel of food. The scenes of want and misery were indescribable. In retaliation for these acts, by Early's orders, I burned Chambersburg. I have no apology to make. My conscience is clear. So this was McCausland's response. Now let's talk about Robert E. Lee for a minute. I think you're going to find this one very interesting. This was his General Order number 73. Now, this is a man who knew international law at the time. He was a Christian general. And let's see what he said about all this. The duties exacted of us by civilization and Christianity are not less obligatory in the country of the enemy than in our own. The commanding general considers that no greater disgrace could befall the army, and through it our whole people, than the perpetration of the barbarous outrages upon the innocent and defenseless, and the wanton destruction of property that have marked the course of the enemy in our own country. It must be remembered that we make war only on armed men, and we cannot take vengeance for the wrongs our people have suffered without lowering ourselves in the eyes of all whose abhorrence has been excited by the atrocities of our enemy, and without offending against him to whom vengeance belongeth. Notice the capital on H. Who's he talking about? The man upstairs. To whom vengeance belongeth, without whose favor and support our efforts must all prove in vain. The commanding general, therefore, earnestly exhorts the troops to abstain with the most scrupulous care from unnecessary or wanton injury to private property, and he enjoins upon all officers to arrest and bring to summary punishment all who shall in any way offend against the orders on this subject. Now, isn't it really funny that Robert E. Lee could issue this and keep his troops in order, and Sherman could issue similar orders, not keep his troops in order, and hide behind what was going on, saying he wasn't able to control it? General John B. Gordon, who's one of my favorite generals, he's from Georgia, in his reminiscences, relates an incident that illustrates the strict obedience to the civilized law of warfare that was observed by General Lee. This is a very interesting story. When the Confederate Army crossed into Maryland in 1862, this would have been the Sharpsburg campaign, General Lee witnessed a Southern soldier with a stolen pig under his arm, a violation of the stringent orders he'd issued. It was directed that the soldier be arrested and turned over to General Stonewall Jackson to be shot. Now, was he serious about enforcing this? Yeah, very serious about it. General Jackson, not having time to convene a court-martial because of preparations for the coming Battle of Sharpsburg, put the culprit in front of the army so he might be killed by an opponent's bullet. Sounds kind of like Uriah the Heap, doesn't it? Okay? Thus saving red tape. The soldier evaded death in the battle, and his conspicuous courage purchased his redemption. But what? The lesson was learned by the Army. You didn't see the Army of Northern Virginia doing this kind of trash. It's under the control of the general, and don't think otherwise. What did the United States and international law say at this time about war crimes and civilized warfare? Why don't we take a look at the law here at the time? In the early 1860s, international law and the U.S. government's own military code, what was called the Liber Code, General Order 100, okay, it prohibited the intentional targeting of civilians in war, although it was recognized that civilian casualties are always inevitable. Okay? They're inevitable. You shoot a cannon and it goes in the wrong place, kill somebody, that's inevitable. But you do not intentionally target civilians. That was the law. Foraging to feed an army was also acceptable, but what was required? Compensation, payment. If you foraged and you didn't pay for it, it was theft or it was pillage. And seizures of assets were limited to items necessary and useful. Remember that term. That's a key, critical term to remember. Only items necessary and useful to military operations. The kind of wanton looting and destruction of private property that was practiced by the Union Army for the duration of the war was forbidden. And perpetrators were, as mandated by applicable law, to be imprisoned, hanged, or severely punished, not promoted. And when I get to a few slides in a moment, I'm going to show you the Turchin affair, where somebody who did this kind of trash was actually promoted by Abraham Lincoln. Now, all of this was described in great detail in the book International Law that was authored by San Francisco attorney Henry Halleck, this gentleman right here, who was appointed by Lincoln as General-in-Chief of the Union armies in July 1862. This man wrote the book on international law. He knew about international law. He knew what it said. He knew what was right and what was wrong in the engagement of war. Yet, on December 18, 1864, he wrote Sherman, "Should you capture Charleston, I hope that by some accident the place may be destroyed, and if a little salt is thrown upon its site, it may prevent the future growth of nullification and secession." Very interesting comment from the chief lawyer of the federal armies of the United States of America. Now, this was Mr. Liber, Franz Liber, who wrote the code. And let's look at specifically what some of the articles of this code said. This was issued by Liber and was promulgated as General Order Number 100 by no one less than President Abraham Lincoln. Article 44, all wanton violence committed against persons in the invaded country, all destruction of property not commanded by the authorized officer, all robbery, all pillage or sacking, even after taking a place by force, all rape, wounding, maiming, or killing of inhabitants are prohibited under what? Penalty of death, or such other severe punishments as may be seen adequate for the gravity of the offense. A soldier, officer, or private in the act of committing such violence and disobeying a superior ordering him to abstain from it may be lawfully killed on the spot by such superior officer. This was the law. This was supposed to govern the conduct of the Union troops in the field. But the official records are like 128 books. And these records contain letters and orders going back and forth from the field commanders to the various generals, and they were written contemporaneously with the events. So they're reliable, okay? And they were compiled by the War Department over a period of years, and they contain 138,000 pages. Now, you want to know something that's reliable? That's contemporaneous evidence, okay, that was written by people when they did it, when they lived through it. Not somebody who's on his deathbed trying to write his memoirs, okay, and salvage his reputation before he dies by claiming that everything that happened was an accident. So let's go back to 1862. On June the 18th, Sherman, who was in charge of the 5th Division in LaGrange, 70 miles southeast of Memphis, issued his Order 44. Let's read Sherman's words. Too much looseness exists on the subject of foraging. The articles of war make it almost a capital offense. Isn't that what we just read a minute ago? In Article 44 of the Labor Code. For an officer or soldier to pillage, which means taking private property for his own use. Okay. Again, in Moscow, Tennessee, he says, stealing, robbery, and pillage has become so common in this army that it's a disgrace to any civilized people. This demoralizing and disgraceful practice of pillage must cease, else the country will rise on us and justly shoot us down like dogs and wild beasts. Does it sound to you like somebody who knows what the law is? They're quoting it. They're quoting it contemporaneously as things happen. This is what they're writing down. Obviously, they think this is the law, and this is what they believe it to be. On September 4th, 1862, he was complaining to Grant about Josiah Bizzle, who was a Missouri engineer, and in condemning Bizzle's actions, he said, he's so energetic and full of zeal that I fear he may cause the very thing we endeavor to prevent, that is the firing on boats. We must be careful not to render ourselves too harsh, or they, meaning the Confederate forces, will naturally seek revenge. He has just destroyed some houses at Huckle Roads, below where we are. So at this point, he certainly thought it was bad to destroy houses. He's condemning this other man for destroying a house. Now, the right wing of the 13th Army in College Hill, 6 miles from Oxford, Sherman says, the indiscriminate and extensive plundering by our men calls for summary and speedy charge. Our mission is to maintain, not to violate all laws, human and divine. Do you think this plunder is going on? This is a contemporaneous letter. If it wasn't going on, why did he say it was going on? This is an admission against interest in the law. He just made an admission that his army is doing something illegal, and he thinks it's wrong and it needs to be stopped. On January 12th, while commanding the 15th Army Corps at Arkansas Post, not too far from Little Rock, he issued Order Number 3. Ignorance of the rules of war as to pillage and plunder can no longer be pleaded. Laws of Congress, orders of the President, and my own, his own orders, have again and again been published. Ignorance can no longer be pleaded. Now keep that in your mind for a minute. Then Major General John McClernand, commander of the Federal Army, was aboard the steamship Tigris near Napoleon, Arkansas in January of 1863, and he ordered Sherman to take measures immediately to extinguish the flames which are consuming the town of Napoleon, and find, if possible, the incendiaries and punish them. Place guards to stop the scandals which are being perpetrated by worthless men. Well, they may have been worthless men. They were worthless men in the Union Army. Same day, Sherman replies from the Forest Queen, on which he was on board, and says, pursuant to your orders this morning at 4 p.m., I went into person to direct the extinguishment of the fire in Napoleon. It was impossible to extinguish it. I first tried to limit it to the middle of the block, but failed. But by the destruction of a store and a barn at the end of the block, I limited the fire to 1 block. It's also impossible to find out the incendiary. No man in this army has labored harder than I have to check this spirit in our soldiers, and am free to admit we all deserve to be killed unless we can produce a state of discipline when such disgraceful acts cannot be committed unpunished. So he recognizes the problem. He recognizes the penalty for it too. Then He encamped near Vicksburg. He wrote to Major General Frederick Steele, "War is at best barbarism, but to involve all, children, women, old and helpless, is more than can be justified." More than can be justified. Our men will become absolutely lawless unless this can be checked. I think it injures our men to allow them to plunder indiscriminately the inhabitants of the country. He seems like he really knows law, doesn't he? He ought to. He's an officer. He's under the library code. He's quoting it pretty well. Then he says, "It is represented to me that the provost marshal is giving license to the soldiers to take the content of stores, taking things not necessary or useful." Oh, necessary or useful. Where did we hear that a minute ago? Oh, I forgot. It was in the library code, wasn't it? Yeah, the law governing the Union troops. And now he's reciting that law that you can't take things unless they're necessary or useful. "The feeling of pillage and booty will injure the moral of our troops and bring disgrace on our cause." On August the 4th, he encamped on the Big Black River in Mississippi, and he wrote to General Grant, the commanding officer, "The amount of burning, stealing, and plundering done by our army makes me ashamed of it. I would quit the service if I could, because I fear we're drifting to the worst sort of vandalism. You and I and every commander must go through the war justly chargeable with crimes at which we blush." Justly chargeable with what? Crimes. War crimes. War crimes. So I ask you, after seeing all this, when General Grant then comes back and says, "Conduct disgraceful to the American name has been frequently reported to the Major General, particularly on the part of portions of the cavalry. Summary punishment must be inflicted upon all officers and soldiers apprehended in acts of violence or lawlessness." So now we've got Sherman and Grant both acknowledging that they know better. They know what is supposed to be done in war and how war is supposed to be conducted and supposed to be kept civilized. Incidentally, I have the cites to these, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, in the volume that these appear in. So I ask you, is there anybody out there who thinks, can I see one hand, anybody out there who thinks Sherman didn't know right from wrong? How many people think he did know right from wrong? Okay, that's everybody. I didn't see one hand go up the other way. So everybody in here is in general agreement that Sherman knew right from wrong. Okay? Next chapter. Less than 6 months later, listen to the change in Sherman's writings. The government of the United States has in North Alabama any and all rights which they choose to enforce in war. To take their lives. Who's there? The soldiers weren't around. There. You mean civilians. To take their lives. Their homes. Their homes. He was just condemning another man for burning a house. Their land, their everything, because war does exist there, and war is simply power unrestrained by constitution or compact. Wait a minute, what's the library code? What was he citing just a minute ago as being the law? What about General Order 100 from Abraham Lincoln? Oh, war is unrestrained, so I can do what I want to. I can take their everything. I can take their house. I can take their homes. I can take their gold pocket watches. That's what he specialized in. And then he goes on to say, to the petulant and persistent secessionists, why, death is mercy. And the quicker he or she is disposed of, the better. Satan and the rebellious saints of heaven were allowed a continuous existence in hell merely to swell their just punishment. To such as would rebel against a government so mild and just as ours was in peace, a punishment equal, that is to remain in hell, would not be unjust. Is this a little bit different than what we were hearing a few minutes ago? Who has he become to punish Southern civilians in the same manner as in hell? Is he God? Is he Satan? Who is he? What has he become in this last 6 months? Why this sudden change? Was it the tide of the war? Remember, he said we better not do this. They might seek revenge. Okay? We've got war crimes out there. We might be convicted of war crimes. Had the tide of the war changed, so now he thought the North was going to win? There was no way they weren't going to win, so now he could just do whatever he wanted to? And he could never be convicted of war crimes, therefore there could be no revenge? Or did this have to do with Lincoln's political prospects? Because during this time, Lincoln met with Grant and with Sherman, and they had a coordinated policy of scorched earth. Okay? So was it maybe Lincoln seeking to attain re-election at all costs? So therefore he ordered a policy of total war against the South in violation of all civilized rules of war. Also, he could hold on to his ill-gotten power. Must millions of people suffer just so he can hold on to his power? Or maybe I would submit to you there's a C down here. Both. But something had happened. So, let's now see what happened. First thing we're going to do is we don't think that Union officers would be saying these kinds of things are happening unless these kinds of things are happening. Right? I mean, that's proof that they were happening, that his own officers are saying that they are happening. Okay? And they're reliable. They are an admission against interest in the law. That's a good form of evidence in a court. So, William T. Shaw, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Division, writes, men of this command have been guilty of pillaging from private houses, articles of no value to the soldiers, but important to every household. He calls it a species of plunder unknown to civilized warfare. So here you have a good, honest general who's calling it like it is, and he's saying this is what's going on and this isn't right. Okay? But it's an admission that it's going on. Then, Major John Logan says, a major of colored troops is here with his party capturing Negroes with or without their consent. They're being conscripted into the army at the point of a bayonet to fight for the Yankees, whether they want to fight for the Yankees or not. Now, wait a minute. I thought that the whole purpose of the Union Army coming down here was to liberate the African race, not to put them at the point of a bayonet against their will into a blue suit, to go be used, as General Hunter said at Battery Wagner, when he was trying to test the strength of the fortification. Okay? In the movie Glory, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw says, sir, there's a heart to fighting. It's not all just how much rest you have, but how much heart there is. And the 54th wants to charge. Well, I got news for you. That sounds real good on a Hollywood screen, but read the official records of the War of the Rebellion. Hunter said, we'll send in the 54th as cannon fodder. These people that we took off the farm against their will, okay, put them in a blue suit and told them, you're going to fight for your freedom. And there's language in the official records that says that they were to be used as cannon fodder. So Sherman aboard the Diana says, when he writes to Halleck, remember Halleck, he's the one that wrote the book on international law, right? We lived off the country and made a swath of desolation 50 miles broad across the state of Mississippi, which the present generation will not forget. I added the phrase, the present generation of civilians, because there were no troops to speak of there to stop the march across Mississippi. So it's the present generation of civilians that would remember this in Mississippi. Now, Colonel Ignatz Kapner, 2nd U.S. Heavy Artillery, colored troops, near Memphis. You don't teach you this in history in school. The white cavalry broke in mass into camps of the colored women and are committing all sorts of outrage. The black is made a man by being trusted with arms. And it is very hard for a man to see his family abused and not to use the arm. And that's why H.K. Edgerton, if you know who I'm talking about, to this day is a strong person who believes in Confederate principles. He's a black man because this happened to his family. And it's passed down through the family, and the family knows it. And they've kept all this in mind. This is very interesting. One Union unit commanded by Colonel John Turchin, I told you I'd talk about this in a minute. He moved into Athens, Alabama, and with his approval, his unit spent several weeks in the slave huts debauching the females. Now, Turchin's superior officers court-martialed him and convicted him for crimes. Guess what happened? It was all forgiven. He was pardoned by Honest Abe. And I hope you people realize Honest Abe wasn't honest, okay? Honest Abe was called that as a source of derision, just like in Robin Hood you had Little John. Little John, 6'5", 300 pounds. Okay, Honest Abe was not so honest. Honest Abe pardoned him and promoted Turchin to a brigadier general. Now, what kind of message does that send to your army when your commander-in-chief has just promoted to brigadier general a man who had been convicted by his own army for debauching females in violation of the rules of law? This is the message that was sent. We have Atlanta. Sherman in Big Shanty, Georgia, communicated to Secretary of War Stanton, there is a class of people in the South, men, women, and children, who must be killed or banished before you can hope for peace and order. And Stanton, Secretary of War, writes back, your letter of the 21st has just reached me and meets my approval. So you have the administration in the North backing what Sherman's doing down here. The administration in the North is backing this. All of this is going on. Oliver Otis Howard. Now, this guy is a good guy. He really is a good guy, and I'm going to tell you more about him. Near Jonesboro, Georgia, he says there's been from this army today between 1,500 to 2,000 stragglers, a great many of them teamsters, and numbers of them have been guilty of the vilest conduct, entering houses where there were women and little children and utterly destroying everything, stealing knives, forks, spoons, opening trunks, conduct so shameful and so disgraceful to our army. They are the vilest miscreants. Man, call it like he sees it. He's admitting it's going on. So therefore, it's pretty reliable that it's going on. He thinks it's wrong. He was a good Christian gentleman. Sherman, on the other hand, on October 9th, wrote Grant, until we can repopulate Georgia, it's useless to occupy it, but the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia how? Who? The civilians of Georgia, because where are the men? They're on the battlefields of Virginia and the Army of Northern Virginia. They're not down here. It's real easy to make a lot of women and children howl when you march through with 62,500 people, most of whom were Dutch, German, or Irish, didn't speak a word of English, marched through, dug up the graves of your grandmothers looking for rings on their fingers, and didn't have anybody, not even their own officers, to stop them from doing it. Smashing things to the sea. Sherman says, I could infinitely prefer with my army to move through Georgia smashing things to the sea. I bet he would. He can go through smashing things to the sea, and every house that his men go into, they can loot and pillage and take everything out of the house. Okay? And they don't have any resistance. There was an army following, there was a whole wagon train following Sherman's army. 3,000 wagons. They didn't have wounded soldiers in them. They didn't have supplies in them. They had loot in them. Loot. Howard again says, soldiers of the Army of the Tennessee. Today, soldiers of our army entered houses and opened trunks, drawers, and boxes, utterly destroying everything they could lay their hands on. They took from women and children the last morsel of food. Now, where do we hear that? The last morsel of food. Didn't we hear that when General Early was describing what happened up north in the valley in Virginia? Yeah, exactly the same words. Last morsel of food from a different person. So corroboration. One corroborates the other. In some cases, these things were done under the eyes of commissioned officers and in a manner as if it were a frolic. Put a stop to these actions, which are criminal and must lower us in the estimation of all honorable men and have a tendency to undermine our government. Pillaging is a crime by every law. So Sherman says at Summerville, Georgia on the 19th, they, meaning the civilians of Georgia, don't know what war means, but when the rich planters of the Oconee savannah see their fences and corn and hogs and sheep vanish before their eyes, they'll have something more than a mean opinion of the Yanks. The poor people come to me and beg as for their lives. I will eat out this flank down along the Coosa. So, far different language than what he was using earlier when he knew what the law was. Now he's just disregarding the law. So, General Henry Slocum says, I submit the following suggestions. Robinson reported to Slocum, He says, I submit the following suggestions for commanding officers of foraging expeditions. Men not connected with their command should not be permitted to accompany the expedition. They are usually men of the most depraved and worthless character who accompany the expedition for the purpose of plundering private houses and committing outrages upon defenseless females. This class of men brings disgrace upon the army. Yeah, sure did. Brought a lot of disgrace. Even though it brought a lot of disgrace, history books record William Tecumseh Sherman as one of the finest generals that ever served in the blue suit. Now, Major General Jefferson C. Davis, not our Jefferson Davis, Jefferson C. Davis at Occoquechee, I can't pronounce it, River, he issued a circular. The Corps commander has observed within the last 2 days a great increase of straggling and marauding and indiscriminate destruction of property and burning of the homes of women and children. Here again, admission against interest by one of their generals that this is going on. Now, notice the date, November 18th. Now, I'm about to get your blood boiling in a minute, okay? If your blood's not boiling now, that's all right. It'll be in a minute, believe me. Catherine Jones wrote a book called When Sherman Came, Southern Women in the Great March. This is the book right here, okay? It's a compilation of diaries written by women who were in the direct line of march of Sherman's army. These letters were written contemporaneously as it was happening. In the law, they would be given tremendous amount of validity as evidence because they were either excited utterances. If my son were to say to me, so-and-so told me that so-and-so happened, well, that might not be admissible in a court of law because that would be called hearsay. But there is an exception to hearsay. It's called excited utterances. Because when something bad happens and you respond, you run a right light, hit somebody, and you jump out and say, oh my God, I'm sorry I ran over you. Well, that's an excited utterance. You can admit, even if somebody heard somebody else say it and told you, even though it's hearsay, it can be introduced because it's an exception to the hearsay rule. So excited utterances, the law respects very, very heavily in evidence. They were contemporaneous, not written years and years later. That gives them validity. And they're corroborated from several sources. Now, we hear from the general saying houses were burned. Well, that's kind of anesthetic, isn't it? That's kind of sterile. We know what happened because they said it. But let's just take a little bit of look from the victims of this, what they said in their diaries, okay? Which is corroboration of what the generals were saying. Therefore, its validity as evidence is almost unquestionable. Okay? This was a woman named Dolly Sumner Lunt Burge. She says, the heavens were lit up like flames. She's talking about when the Union troops came up to her house. But like demons, they rushed in. My yards are full. To my smokehouse, my dairy, pantry, kitchen, and cellar. Like famished wolves, they come, breaking locks and whatever's in their way. The 1,000 pounds of meat in my smokehouse is gone in a twinkling. My flour, my meat, my lard, butter, eggs, pickles of various kinds, both in vinegar and brine, wine, jars and jugs, all gone. My 18 fat turkeys, my hens, chickens, and fowls, my young pigs are shot down in my yard and hunted as if they were the rebels themselves. Utterly powerless, I dare to appeal to the guard. He says, I cannot help you, madam. It is the orders. The Union officer tells this woman, it's the orders. This is a contemporaneous diary. But you hadn't heard the worst yet. The animals they didn't take with them because they had too many of them. They just shot them and killed them so the Southerners wouldn't have them. They intended to starve them out. But this is very interesting. But alas, little did I think while trying to save my house from plunder and fire that they were forcing at the point of a bayonet my boys from home. Now what she means by boys is the young blacks who lived on her plantation. They were forcing her boys from home. One, Newton, jumped into the bed in his cabin and declared himself sick. Another crawled under the floor. A lame boy he was, but they pulled him out and placed him on a horse and drove him off. Poor Mid, the last I saw him, a man had him going round the garden, looking as I thought for my sheep as he was my shepherd. No, they were trying to dig into the ground to find jewels that had been buried. Jack came to me crying, the big tears coursing down his cheeks, saying they were making him go. I said, stay in my room, but a man followed in, cursing him and threatening to shoot him if he did not go. Poor Jack had to yield. James Arnold, in trying to escape from a back window, was captured and marched off. Henry, too, was taken. I know not how or when, but probably when he and Bob went after the mules. I had not believed they would force from their homes the poor doomed Negroes. But such has been the fact here, cursing them and saying that Jeff Davis was going to put them in his army. But they should fight, not fight for Jeff Davis, but for them. No, indeed, no, they are not friends to the slave. Their parents are with me, and how sadly they lament the loss of their boys. Their cabins are rifled of every valuable. The soldiers swearing that their Sunday clothes were the white people's, and they never had time to get such things as they had. Poor Frank's chest was broken open, his money and tobacco taken. He's always been a money-making and saving boy. Not infrequently had his crop brought him $500 and more. All his clothes and Rachel's clothes were stolen. As night drew its sable curtains around us, the heavens from every point were lit up with flames from burning buildings. Dinnerless and supperless as we were, it was nothing in comparison to the fear of being driven out homeless and houseless to the dreary woods. Starting to boil yet? This is pretty convincing evidence if you're looking at it from a legal standpoint. Now, Frank Blair says the outrages committed by your command during the march are common and of an aggravated nature, the pillaging of houses and wanton destruction of property by your regiment. That's when he's writing to Colonel George Spencer, 1st Alabama Cavalry. The cavalry were the really bad guys in this game. So now we have, the Army lived on the land as it traveled through Georgia and lived well, observed a New York Herald correspondent who accompanied the Army. General Sherman's bomber department had a train of more than 3,000 wagons and ambulances. There are hundreds of these mounted men with the column, said the same correspondent. They go everywhere. Some of them are loaded down with silverware, gold coin, and other valuables. I hazard nothing on saying that 3/5 in value of the personal property of the counties we passed through were taken by Sherman's army. Imagine that, 3/5. People moved over here from Europe in the 1700s to get away from what was going on over there. They had freedom. They worked hard. They worked their farm. They made some money. They finally got a house. They built a house. They built a barn. They bought a gold watch. People come through in violation of all the laws of civilization and their own code, the Liber Code of the time. Steal everything, burn everything, and leave a lot of these people homeless. So, on December 1st, Sherman marched toward Millen. General Hardee moved to Savannah, and on the 3rd, Sherman entered Millen and left it sacked and burning. Now, let me tell you about Howard. I told you he was called the Christian general. This was a good man. The Federal Army could be very proud of this man. Oliver Howard was born in Maine. His father was a farmer and died when Oliver was 9. He graduated from Bowdoin College at the age of 19 in 1850. He attended the military academy. He graduated in 1854, fourth in his class out of 46. He was a brevet second lieutenant of ordnance. In 1855, he married Elizabeth Ann Waite, with whom he would have 7 children. In 1857, he was transferred to Florida for the Seminole Wars. It was in Florida that he experienced a conversion to evangelical Christianity, and he considered resigning from the Army to become a minister. His religious proclivities would later earn him the nickname the Christian General. He returned to West Point in September of 1857 to become an instructor of mathematics. The following year, he was promoted to first lieutenant. As the war began with the surrender of Fort Sumter, thoughts of the ministry were put aside, and he decided to remain in the service of his country, but always living and commanding in accordance with his beliefs. And he really did. This was a good soldier, a good Christian gentleman, and he ought to be praised by history. He tried to stop the vandalism. He issued Special Field Order number 175. The crimes of arson and robbery have become frequent throughout this army. He's saying what happened. That's an admission against interest. It's an admission against his army. That's what was going on. So we just heard what the officer said. Now let's look at some corroboration from the diaries. Wheeler's men went dashing by. This is General Joseph Wheeler, the Confederate Army, the cavalry that tried to nip on Sherman's heels all the way down from Atlanta. His men were retreating. They went flying by. The road was a mass of blue men. The surrounding fields were full of them. In a few minutes, our house was filled with surging mass. In a little while, there was not a piece of china, silver, or even the tablecloth left, and the food disappeared in a second. Fences were torn down, hogs shot, cows butchered, women crying, children screaming. Pandemonium reigned. Then the jail, the courthouse, people's barns, and a large factory that made buckets and saddle trees were all ablaze. General Sherman found out about the shooting of 12 prisoners of war, so he ordered the town razed. Then old brother Anthony, the Methodist preacher, went to him in the name of the women and children, declaring that those who did the atrocious deeds were not even Georgians, much less inhabitants of Sandersville and Washington County. The stern commander was not moved. Brother Anthony pled in the name of Christ, but General Sherman was not a Christian. From Saturday morning until Monday, many inhabitants had neither food nor water. It seems beyond belief that not a chicken was left, not a hog, and only a few cows. No meal nor flour. The ground was strewn with food. Carpets were drenched with syrup and then covered with meal. Negro soldiers entered private homes in search for valuables. Now, this is what she had to say. It kind of sounds real familiar with the last one we heard, doesn't it? It sounds kind of familiar with what we heard that was going on in the valley. It was going on everywhere. It was war policy. Sherman was just the most capable person of carrying it out in a fiendish manner. So Howard again complained, inexcusable and wanton acts. We found the country full of provisions and forage. Quite a number of private dwellings had been destroyed by fire. If they hadn't been, would he be saying it? Would he be making an admission against interest against his own army? If that hadn't happened? No, it's a mission against interest. It's reliable. Also, in many instances of the most inexcusable and wanton acts, such as the breaking open of trunks, taking of silver plate. This is Nora Canning. She says, on Sunday, November 28th, we heard the destroyers were encamped just above our plantation, about 4 miles from our home. That night, the heavens looked as if they were on fire from the glare of hundreds of burning houses, And early Monday morning, a Negro man came from the upper plantation and told us they were crossing the river, and some of them were in Louisville, about 2 miles off. Also that they were searching the houses, breaking open the stores, setting fire to them, and killing all the stock they could find. It sounds just like what the Union General said was happening. Now, if your blood's not boiling yet, get ready. Get ready. This is canning continued. Just then I saw my husband coming up on a bareback mule with a Yankee soldier on each side of him, holding him on. He was brought up to the piazza, lifted from the mule, and brought into the house. They took him into a small room, and I followed. He turned to me and requested to me to give the men his watch. Why? I asked him. They have no business with your watch. Give it to them, he repeated with a gasp, and let them go. I am almost dead. Mrs. S., whatever her name was, it just said that in the diary, was standing by, and I told her to get the watch. She, without thinking, asked me if I meant Judge H's watch, and I answered yes. Of course, the Yankees inferred from her remark that she knew where the other valuables were concealed, and they made her yield up everything. Now, I will tell you from reading these letters, I've only been able to give you a very small sample. There are hundreds of letters like this, okay? Hundreds of them. I couldn't begin to put them all in a speech. But often it was by putting guns to the heads of the women that they got them to turn over the jewels, okay? Or threatening to burn their home, okay? Or other acts that I will not even mention because we're in mixed company. She says, I got my husband to his room as soon as possible and found he was very faint, though I thought it was from fatigue. Imagine my horror, therefore, when he had recovered sufficiently to talk, to hear that the fiends had taken him to the swamp and hanged him. He said he suspected no harm till he got about 2 miles from the house when they stopped and taking him from the mule said, now, old man, you have to tell us where your gold is hidden. He told him he had no gold, that he had gone down to his plantation for a short visit and has left his money at home in the bank. They cursed him and told him that story would not do, that his wife had gone up to Macon and brought it all down, for a Negro man had told them she brought a trunk full of gold and silver down there. And he could scarcely lift the trunk, it was so heavy. They then said they had brought him to the swamp to make him tell them where it was. He told them he had no gold. They then took him to a tree that bent over the path, tied a rope around his neck, threw it over a projecting limb, and drew him up until his feet were off the ground. He did not quite lose consciousness when they let him down and said, now, where's your gold? An old man. Now, I will tell you, in reading this book that I cited a minute ago, there probably when Sherman came Southern women in the Great March, there are probably 8 examples in there from women in different parts of the state at different times who didn't have the internet, and they all tell the same story about the men being hung and the slaves being hung and even threatening to hang the women. And in 2 letters, they stripped the women naked, beat them with whips, and poured molasses on their body. What do you think General Robert E. Lee would have done if one of his men had done that? This is not all. He told them the same story the second time they hung him, whereupon one of them cried, we'll make you tell another story before we're done with you, so pull him up again, boys. They raised him up again, and that time he said he felt as if he were suffocating. They again lowered him to his feet and cried out fiercely, now tell us where the gold is or we'll kill you, and your wife will never know what has become of you. I've told you the truth. I have no gold, he again repeated, adding, I'm an old man and at your mercy. If you want to kill me, you have the power to do it, but I cannot die with a lie on my lips. I have no gold. I have a gold watch at the house, but nothing else. He didn't have it long, because when they got there, they made that lady turn it over. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, said, swing the old rebel up again. They then lifted him up and let him fall with more force than before. He heard a sound as if it were water rushing through his head. And then a blindness came over him. A dry, choking sensation was felt in his throat as he lost consciousness. Oh, the horrors of that night. None but God will ever know what I suffered. There my husband lay with scorching fever, his tongue parched and swollen, and his throat dry and sore. He begged for water, and there was not a drop to be had. The Yankees had cut all the well ropes and stolen the buckets, and there was no water nearer than half a mile away. Now, were they being mean just to be mean? No. They were being mean to steal and loot and plunder. That's why they had 3,000 wagons behind their train full of loot. Some of these diaries, the women report, they're sitting on their porch or their veranda when these wagon trains come by filled with loot. And most of those wagon trains either went to Hilton Head or they went to Wilmington, and they were shipped north. So somebody in here is making a little bit of money off this war. Canning continued. This beats it all, okay? I mean, if your blood's not boiling now, it ought to be on high. The rear of the army encamped that night about 4 or 5 miles from us. We could see the glare of fires and knew from our own experience the work of destruction was going on. The citizens of Burke County being wealthy, the spoils were great. Saturday morning, we looked out on a scene of desolation and ruin. We could hardly believe it was our home. 1 week before, it was one of the most beautiful places in the state. Now it was a vast wreck. Gin houses, packing screws, granary, all lay in ashes. Not a fence was to be seen for miles. The corn crop had not been gathered, and the army had turned their stock into the fields and destroyed what they could not carry off. Dead animals everywhere, awful stench. Burning cotton and grain filled the air with smoke, and even the sun seemed to hide its face from so gloomy a picture. If this doesn't turn your stomach, you're not a human. The poor Negroes had fared no better than we had. Their friends had stolen everything from us, everything from them as well as from us. Their master had given them a month's rations, thinking that they would be able to save it, but they had provisions, clothing, and everything taken from them. Even their shoes were taken from their feet. Their chickens had all been killed, and their beds and bedding carried off. Poor creatures, they looked so disconsolate, and when they saw their master, the older ones burst out crying. Master, they asked piteously, what are we all going to do now? Everything's gone, nothing left for us to eat. I can't tell, he answered sadly. It looks as if we all have to starve together. One of the Negro women was sitting on her doorstep, swaying her body back and forth and making a mournful noise, a kind of moaning, a low, sorrowful sound, occasionally wringing her hands and crying. As we approached her, she raised her head. Master, she said, rolling her eyes strangely, what kind of folks these here Yankees? They won't even let the dead rest in the grave. What do you mean, he asked. You know my child, what I buried last week? They take him up and left him on top of the ground for the hog to root. For the hog to root. Would not even rebury a child. You know why they did this? And then she says, what do you think of that, sir? See, they thought that the Confederates were burying their treasure in caskets and putting it in the ground in the cemetery. So they would go into the cemeteries and dig up the graves, hoping that the fresh graves would have treasure. And they'd take the bodies out and just leave them on the ground, black or white. But they'd also dig up other graves to see if the missus who had died had rings on her fingers. General Howard, painful cases of robbery have come to my attention, such as money stealing. Mary Jones Mallard, talking of Kilpatrick's cavalry. They flew around the house, tearing open boxes, everything that was closed. They broke open Mother's little work table with an andiron, hoping to find money or jewelry. It contained principally little mementos that were valuable only to her. Failing to find treasure, they broke the sweet little locks of golden hair that her mother had cut from the heads of her angel children nearly a half a century ago, scattered them on the floor and trampled them underfoot. A number of them rifled the sideboard, taking away knives, spoons, forks, tin cups, coffee pots, and everything they wished. It was vain to utter a word, for we were completely paralyzed by the fury of these ruffians. A number of them went into the attic, into a little storeroom, and carried off 12 bushels of meal that Mother had stored for our necessities. She told them they were taking all she had to support herself and daughter, a friend and 5 little children. Scarcely one regarded the sound of her voice. Those who did laughed and said they would leave one sack to keep us from starving, but they only left some rice, which they didn't want, and poured out a quart or so of meal on the floor. At other times, they said they meant to starve us to death. They searched trunks and bureaus and wardrobes, calling for shirts and men's clothes. So these men coming through the house, taking everything, plundering. Most of the time you read in these letters as they left, they took a torch and tried to burn the house down, but then as soon as they lit the fire under the front steps or the back steps, they'd run off, and the slaves there that were still on the plantations would put the fires out because that was their house too. She goes on to say, we asked for their officer, hoping to make some appeal to him. They said they were all officers and would do as they pleased. They brought a wagon and took another from the place to carry off their plunder. It's impossible to imagine the horrible uproar and stomping through the house, every room of which was occupied by them, all yelling, cursing, quarreling, and running from one room to another in wild confusion. Such was their blasphemous language, their horrible countenances and appearance, that we realize what must be the association of the lost in the world of eternal woe. Their throats were open sepulchres, their mouths filled with cunning and bitterness and lies. These men belonged to Kilpatrick's cavalry. We look back upon their conduct in the house as a horrible nightmare, too terrible to be true. Howard again says, many men not belonging to proper foraging parties are allowed to straggle and forage themselves without authority. It's by such men the greater part of the pillaging is done and depredations committed. Here's another lady in Midway. As I stepped into the kitchen door, I saw the grist had been appropriated by a man, had it in a basket, and was going to the door. I approached him and said, please don't take that meal. My children are very hungry. We have nothing else to eat. He looked savagely at me and said, damn you. I don't care if you all starve. Get out of my way or I'll push you out the door. He thrust the basket against her and pushed her out the door. She would have fallen down had somebody not caught her. Sounds like a real civilized army to me. What is conspicuously missing in the official records that serves to convict William T. Sherman? Not a single order from Sherman to his generals after the 4th of 1863. That was the last one we read before he went to the dark side. Okay? Commanding them to cease and desist from the commission of these heinous acts he had already admitted were vandalism, absolutely disgraceful, crimes of which we blush and for which we are justly chargeable. In the law, this might be construed as an admission of guilt through silence. In the law, when somebody accuses you of something and it is like reprehensible conduct, you have a duty to defend yourself, to deny it and say, that's not true. Well, he was accused of all this, but and his men were telling all about it. They were all explaining it in correspondence that went back and forth, but he was silent about all of it. Didn't issue any more of these, we're drifting toward vandalism. Oh my, we all deserve to be killed for the crimes which we are committing. None of that. Silence. Kilpatrick said war is terrible and the people of Georgia are being made to feel it. Now this map shows essentially the march of Sherman's army. This is his taking Fort McAllister. Now, near Savannah, Sherman wrote Grant, the whole United States would rejoice to have the army turn loose on South Carolina to devastate that state in the same manner we've done in Georgia. We're in possession of Savannah and all its forts. I could go on and smash South Carolina to pieces. My question is, and loot it too? It's a lot easier and more profitable to loot than to fight the Confederate Army of the Tennessee, which was in Tennessee at the time. This is what he did to Columbia. That's a topic for another speech. But it is worse, if you can believe it, than what I've already been reading to you. This is when he stayed in Savannah, the Green Meldrum House. Now, General Rufus Saxton, the military governor at Beaufort, said the recruiting into the U.S. Army of former slaves went on slowly when the Major General commanding ordered an indiscriminate conscription of every able-bodied colored man in the department. The order spread universal confusion and terror. The Negroes fled to the woods and swamps. They were hunted to their hiding places. Men had been seized and forced to enlist who had large families of young children dependent upon them for support. But I thought they were down here to free the slaves, not to imprison them by putting them at the point of a bayonet into an army, okay, where they would be used as cannon fodder. This is a very interesting story. 3 boys, one only 14 years of age, were seized in a field where they were at work and sent to a regiment in a distant part of the department without the knowledge or consent of their parents. A man on his way to enlist as a volunteer was stopped by a recruiting party. He told them where he was going, was passing on when he was again ordered to halt. He didn't stop, and he was shot dead and left there where he fell. Obviously, they didn't think he was worthy of a burial in the mind of these fiends. The soldiers desired to bring him in and get the bounty offered for bringing in recruits, which Joe Dawson, who introduced me tonight, has studied very thoroughly. And Joe Dawson's told me that what he has read is that you got $100 each for each recruit you brought in. This is at a time when the average monthly pay of the soldiers was like $12. So this poor young black man wanted to run away. And as he started running away, they realized, well, there goes my $100. So if I can't have my $100, he can't have his life. So they shot him. And they killed him. And they left him lying right there. How many of you were taught this in school? This is Rufus Saxon again. I found the prejudice of race and color here in full force, and the general feeling of the army of the occupation was unfriendly to blacks. It was manifested in various forms of personal insult and abuse, and depredations on their plantations. That's a shorthand word for rape. On their plantations, stealing and destroying their crops and domestic animals and robbing them of their money. This was one family on Smith's plantation in Beaufort, South Carolina. They had been together for 5 generations. It was split up. Against their will, they were split up. That's real freedom, isn't it? The black women were held as legitimate prey of lust. Licentiousness was widespread. The influences of too many officers and soldiers was demoralizing to the Negro and has greatly hindered the efforts for their improvement and elevation. There was a general disposition among the soldiers and civilian speculators here to defraud the Negroes in their private traffic, to take the commodities which they offered for sale by force or to pay for them in worthless money. Now, here's where this slide, this is where William Tecumseh Sherman would have been hung in a war crimes court, okay, like Nuremberg, because this is the key admission against interest by him. To Halleck, this lawgiver, we have consumed the corn and fodder in the region of the country 30 miles on either side of a line from Atlanta to Savannah, as also the sweet potatoes, cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry. Been carried away more than 10,000 horses and mules, as well as countless number of their slaves. I estimate the damage done to the state of Georgia, to the people of the state of Georgia, at $100 million, at least $20 million of which has inured to our advantage, and the remainder, $80 million, is simple waste and destruction. That right there is his admission that it was waste and destruction would have had him convicted if the South had somehow won that war of a war crime. This is worse than some of the people that you heard about at Nuremberg. Okay? This would not have been a defense. This may seem a hard species of warfare, but it brings the sad realities of war home. As to the rank and file, a little loose foraging. They did some things they ought not to have done. Well, this is a confession of guilt and admission against interest. Sherman, today, who bullied innocent women and children in a land unprotected by soldiers, is considered one of the most brilliant military commanders that ever served in the world. He sounds more to me like a Nazi war criminal. So now let's revisit Sherman's own words as well as General Order 100 and international law. Was the pillaging, raping, looting, vandalism, and atrocities against Southern civilization necessary and useful? No. He admitted 80% of it was waste and destruction. It is represented to me that the provost marshal's giving license to the soldier to take the content of stores, taking things not necessary or useful. The feeling of pillage and booty will injure the morals of the troops and bring disgrace on our cause. His own words from early in the war. 80% waste by admission, not necessary or useful. War at best is barbarism, but to involve all, children, women, old, and helpless, is more than can be justified. Our men will become absolutely lawless, you got that right, unless this can be checked. I think it injures our men to allow them to plunder indiscriminately the inhabitants of the country. Well, I would say, going back to his order number 3, there's no way for him to plead lack of knowledge. He can't plead this. He already said you can't plead it. He had sent out order after order after order, so you couldn't plead it. So he can't now plead it, because ignorance of the law of war is no excuse in light of the orders he said he issued over and over. The amount of burning, stealing, and plundering done by our army makes me ashamed of it. I would quit the service if I could, because I fear we are drifting to the worst sort of vandalism. You and I and every commander must go through the war justly chargeable with crimes of which we bless. Okay, so he admits that the acts were war crimes. We all deserve to be killed unless we can produce a state of discipline when such disgraceful acts cannot be committed unpunished. He acknowledges that the penalty is death for war crimes. After all, it was U.S. Grant who said conduct disgraceful has been frequently reported, particularly on the part of the cavalry. Summary punishment must be inflicted on all officers and soldiers apprehended. Why wasn't Sherman punished? The winner doesn't have to abide by the law. The law was summary execution. Now, Mark Grimsley wrote a book, and he cites a letter, and Sherman says, I know that in the beginning I too had the old West Point notion that pillage was a capital crime and punished by shooting. That was an admission against interest. Sherman said an army is a collection of armed men obliged to obey one man. Every change in the rules which impairs the principle weakens the army. So he certainly thought he had control of his army, because the whole army followed one man. Although very often he denied it. I didn't do this, I didn't do that. Oh, these people were just stragglers and they did this and I didn't command it. Yeah, right. You didn't see any of that out of Robert E. Lee's army. But this war differs from other wars in this particular. We're not fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, I added, black and white, feel the hard hand of war. I mean, isn't that the case with every war? Every time you have two armies and one army invades another nation and the people in that nation stand up for themselves, aren't they a hostile people? Isn't that the case in every war? Yet the international law said, no, you don't do that. This is not a justification. Okay? When you look at the law and you look at what was listed as the justifications for war and the justifications for fighting, it didn't include hostile people, hostile civilians, that you could wipe them out. You could leave them without a morsel of food. You could intentionally try to starve them to death so that maybe the Southern armies might disband and come home to try to defend the women. Because there were a lot of men who heard about all this and they deserted and came home to look out for their families and their extended families. So the verdict, I would say he's guilty as charged by a plea of confession. The sentence, he deserves the death penalty for war crimes by his own words of admission. Date for execution of the sentence, summary punishment by virtue of General Order 50, issued by his commander, Ulysses S. Grant. This is from Miner's book called The Real Lincoln, and it's a very good summary of Lincoln's war policy. He says, Sherman looted towns, burned crops, destroyed private property, and in general made war on the civilian population of the South. He called it total war, but it violated the Geneva Convention, and had the South won, it would have been justified in hanging him. In 1864, an international convention met in Geneva, Switzerland, to codify rules of war that had been in existence for more than a century. Nations agreed that it is a war crime punishable by imprisonment or death for armies to attack defenseless cities and towns, plunder and wantonly destroy civilian property, and take from the civilian population more than what was necessary to feed and sustain an occupying army. The only just war was a defensive war. Lincoln launched an offensive war, burned defenseless towns, looted property, and the like. Had the Confederates somehow won, had their victory put them in position to bring their chief opponents before some sort of tribunal, they would have found themselves justified in stringing up President Lincoln and the entire Union High Command for violation of the laws of war, specifically for waging total war against non-combatants. So what was the March to the Sea really all about? I want to see some of this new evidence Georgia's Historical Society has, by the way. I really would like to take a look at some of this contemporaneous research that sheds a new light upon familiar events. What an insult to the people of the city of Savannah and the state of Georgia. I mean, an insult. So let's see what it was really about. You'll really find this interesting. This will really make your blood boil if it's not boiling yet. This is the letter of Thomas J. Myers. My dear wife, I have no time for particulars. We've had a glorious time in the state. Unrestricted license to burn and plunder was the order of the day. It's a very interesting choice of words, don't you think? Unrestricted license. Who can give somebody unrestricted license other than their commanding officer? The chivalry, that's what they call people from the South. The Cavaliers, the Normans, the Celts, they called us the chivalry, have been stripped of most of their valuables, gold watches, silver pitchers, cups, spoons, forks, and so on, are as common in camp as blackberries. The terms of plunder are as follows. The valuables procured are estimated by the companies. Each company is required to exhibit the result of its operations at any given place. 1/5 in the first choice falls to the commander-in-chief and staff. 20% of this loot went to Sherman and his staff. 1/5 to the corps commander and staff. 1/5 to the field officers and 2/5 to the company. Officers are not allowed to join in these expeditions unless disguised as privates. Oh boy, isn't that good? You're going to violate the law, the international law of war, and you're going to disguise yourself as you're a private when you're an officer so you won't get caught. One of our corps commanders borrowed a rough suit of clothes from one of my men and was successful in his place. He got a large quantity of silver, among other things, an old milk pitcher, and a very fine gold watch from Mr. DeSaucer of this place, Columbia. DeSaucer is one of the first families of South Carolina, was made to fork out liberally. Officers over the rank of captain are not made to put their plunder in the estimate for general distribution. So if you're over the rank of captain, you get to keep everything you've got, plus you get 20% of the rest. So these guys are very upset about it. So they say, this is very unfair, and for that reason, in order to protect themselves, the subordinate officers and privates keep everything back that they can carry about their persons, such as rings, earrings, breastpins, which, if I live to get home, I have a quart. I'm not joking. I have at least a quart of jewelry for you and all the girls, and some #1 diamond pins and rings among them. General Sherman has enough gold and silver to start a bank. His share in gold watches and chains alone at Columbia was $275. And it just goes on and on and on. Now, after the war, the Pennsylvania legislature authorized the payment of reparations to those who lost property in Chambersburg and vicinity. Remember when Chambersburg was burned right at the beginning of the slideshow presentation by McCausland? This was an explicit recognition that non-combatants should be reimbursed when wrongs are committed against them in a military setting. But apparently only Northerners were deserving because Southerners, like the Indians, were a dirty race that had to be extirpated by the Puritans. And I think that maybe we should seek reparations in this matter. And that's it. I will tell you that you can't look back on history. Now, people say to me, well, what had happened if the South had won? We wouldn't have been able to defeat the Germans in World War II and wouldn't have been able to defeat the Japanese. And look, aren't you glad we won? Because, we had to win in order to win subsequently. I'm not going to get into that. Okay? I'm not going to let somebody take me there. The fact is that truth is truth. And the most reliable source of determining what evidence produces the truth is contemporaneous accounts, excited utterances, admission against interest, admission against silence, and all these things that would be relied upon in a court of law. Not somebody who puts a marker up and says, we're going to shed new light, a familiar event seen in new light, with no details or anything else. Because what happens is our children and grandchildren read that and they believe the lie. They believe that the war was over slavery and not economics and not taxes. And they make us ashamed of who we are, and they make us ashamed of being the people we are and the race we are. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to stand for that personally. And if you do, that's your choice. But I would strongly encourage you to write a letter to the editor, sign a petition, do whatever you can do. Send it to the Georgia Historical Society, ask them to take that thing down. It's a monstrosity. You want to...
I know you braved the weather, and it was quite a task getting here, but thank you so much, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right, you're welcome.
What to say again?